Hey everyone, I'm Toby at Humanitech, and I'm going to share with you our insights on how you can boost your IDP adoption with the power of examples. Because your platform is a product, right? You've heard that said a lot, and it's true. If it's a product, among other things, it needs proper documentation. So we went out, applied some product thinking, and asked our users what would help you most in terms of documentation to assist you in your daily work. And one of the things that came up over and over again, it would be really cool to have more examples to work with because your users will be writing code a lot. If you're using an IDP, you will be writing workload specifications. You will be writing code to define infrastructure components using Terraform or Kubernetes manifests or code for Pulumi or Acon files or whatever it is, depending on the technology you're using, you will be writing code. Right? So if it's about code, then examples are a very, very powerful way to help users getting started. Here's an example I took out of the Kubernetes documentation. It's on storage classes, incidentally, and after a quick introduction, the authors of this page decided to chip in a small example to see how this works. And that's really very powerful because it shows you the basic concept of this storage class thing in a few lines of code. And you can take that and work from there. This example doesn't have to fit your environment. Chances are it won't, not 100%. It doesn't have to be executable. We see there's even some example code in here. So this is not going to function. However, it is a great assistance to help you get started and adapt it to your needs. So it's kind of simple, right? You chip in some examples and you're good to go. Well, not quite, because we asked some more questions. We asked, how do you go look for content? So where do you want to find examples? Do you browse documentation, or do you use search or AI tools out there? Do you like to browse GitHub repos? And the answer was yes to all of these questions, depending on who you ask, because there's different people and different preferences out there. So people don't all browse documentation. They try to use different things. And also when we asked, well, where would you like to find those examples? Would you like to find them mixed into the content, like the one we just saw for the storage classes? Or maybe would you want a central place to browse examples? Again, the answer was yes to all of these questions, because there's different preferences and different situations out there. So it's not quite as simple to provide examples in the proper way. But to summarize, this is the requirements that we got. So if this is our documentation structure made up of chapters and pages and things, then people told us, well, we would want to see examples here and there and there. We want them contextualized in the topic page that they belong to, that they help to explain. We would also like to see sort of an examples library, a central place to browse that is filled with examples I can have a look at. And we would have these examples found through regular search and maybe through AI as well. So this is the set of requirements that we were facing and tried to deliver on. So this is what we did. Our documentation happens to be Git-based. We are using the Hugo site generator, which is Git-based. You might be using a different tool. You might have a wiki tool, for example, a Confluence, Notion, or whatever. So the technical features I'm going to mention next might not apply to you. However, the principles and the approaches will still be the same, and you will have to figure out a way how to map that into your technology. But let's have a look. So what we did was, as a first exercise, we set up a Git repository, which is here at the bottom, which is our examples repo. The examples repo is the collection of all the examples that we want to provide in a structured manner. We're going to have a look at it in a minute. And then what we did was transfer the content of those of this repository into our documentation repo. There's two Git mechanisms you can use if you happen to be using Git. There's a Git subtree or Git read tree. command that you can use to integrate the content of some repo into your repo and keep it updated all the time. So whenever there's some updates in here, those updates will then be transferred into your downstream repo. And from there, we set up a mechanism to actually populate our example pages and create this example library. So let's have a look. So this is our example library. It's just a plain Git repository, happens to be hosted on GitHub, but that doesn't matter. Here's the score folder that is currently expanded, and you see a bunch of subfolders covering different topics that we want to address in terms of score. So you can use score to define affinity and annotations and cron jobs and whatnot. And all of these topics are bundled in one subfolder. If I expand the subfolder, you'll see there's a README file saying whatever it likes to say. There's not a lot on this one in terms of affinity. And there's example files. Can be one, can be more, showing how to apply this concept. So this is an example file showing how to define an affinity using score. Similar with the annotations, there's a README, and there's two example files on annotations. And in practice, when we transfer this into our documentation, this is the page that is generated out of that structure. So if I go back, show you all of the folders, this will be transformed into a documentation page, which is aptly called score examples, and it features the content of this repository. So here's the affinity and the annotations and the argument command overrides, and each section will correspond to a subfolder in our Git repo. So this is the there's the README content up here, which is very small in this case, and then there's the example files for the argument and command overrides. If you go in here real quick, we'll see there's a README and there's this core YAML, which is displayed here on the right, and there's a link back to GitHub as well if that's what you want to use. So the source code for all of this content, for this documentation, is very small. And this is it. This is what we did was create a shortcode for our documentation system. In this case, it's Hugo. And we said, okay, please at this place in the documentation, integrate all of the contents of the subfolder score and render it onto the page. Render all the readmes, render all the sample files, and turn all subfolders into headers. And this is what we get. The second capability that we had developed is to integrate a specific example file at a specific place in the documentation. So here's another example file that I picked out of the example library source repo, which happens to be a resource definition. And there's a documentation page on the right. It has some regular content, and here at the bottom, there's an example file that is integrated. So it shows the same code. And to do that, all we need to do in our documentation is to, again, integrate a small shortcode, give it the path to the example file that we want to show, and this shortcode will then render the contents of that file onto the page. The third thing that we did was provide this example library that we mentioned. People told us it would be really great to have a go-to place for all things examples. So what we did was create this example library. So here's 3 categories that we have that will be different for your IDP. But again, here's the score files. You can click in here, you can browse them, drill them down, and you can say, okay, I want examples on cron jobs, you get an example on a cron job. Or going back to a more context example of those resource definitions, there's more than one category, and you can say, okay, I want an example on GKE clusters, static credentials, and you're good to go. So this is the go-to place for all things examples that we set up for our users. And that again is generated out of the same content that we saw previously. There's no redundancy. It's just a matter of generating it using the proper tooling. Because this content is now a regular part of a documentation, it is also picked up by the search and the AI that we have integrated. So previously I asked, how can I define a volume using score? This is the question I asked our AI, and it said, okay, I can show you how to do that. Here's the example files, and it will link to the page that we saw previously because it has been trained to ingest that content, and will show the example on the volumes. Cool. So we did that, and it was immensely successful. We looked at the page hits that we get for those two types of categories that I just showed you. There's score, there's these resource definitions. And in both cases, the page hits for the example pages are larger than the anchor pages for the topic. So we get more hits for examples, and then for the score overview, same thing for the resource definitions. So these pages are really very, very popular, and people are in fact using them a lot, which is great to see. What we also did was crowdsource our examples. It was made very easy by the fact that there is a one single source of truth, which is this examples repo that we just saw. It's just a Git repo. Everyone knows how to use that. So we took this into our engineering organization, and now everyone can contribute to those examples, and they will be automatically integrated into our documentation. They will appear on this example page. They will appear in search in AI, and it's very easy to contribute. Also because we're following the pattern of convention over configuration. There is no metadata that you need to enter to contribute an example. All you need to do is follow the folder structure that we set up, and it will automatically be rendered to the proper page on the proper content. One thing you need to make a decision on is what type of documentation do you want to provide. This doesn't only affect examples, it covers any type of documentation that you create. There's a number of taxonomies out there that describe the various types of documentation. The one we like to use is the one by Divio, and it subdivides all types of documentation into 4 quadrants, which is tutorials, how-to guides, explanation, and reference type content. And it's a good idea to make a conscious decision on what type of content you are providing whenever you write documentation. So what we did was make a decision on what it is that the examples are covering. So obviously it is not going to be tutorials, right? This example is not a tutorial, it's also not a how-to guide. Is it a reference or an explanation? Well, if it's a reference, it would have to be precise, it would have to be complete. And we decided that examples should not be a reference, they should rather be an explanation. An example does not replace a specification, it does not replace a reference. However, it is very well suited to explain stuff. So it's not a reference, but it's an explanation type thing instead. If you remember the Kubernetes example I showed you earlier, it explained how to use a storage class. It didn't go into all the details, but it showed the concepts, and it will enable you to go from there. So it's kind of a balance between get you started fast and cover all of the nitty-gritty details. You'll have to find the proper mixture, but at the end of the day, it's an explanation type piece, and it's not a reference. So to sum it up, examples, they're very popular. We can prove that. We can see that in the numbers. They are very popular and sought after. What we did and what we recommend you do as well, to infuse your documentation with contextual examples. Place them whenever you need them, explain a concept, and add an example right away. It will help so much drive home the point. Plus, ideally, also provide this one-stop shopping place for examples. This was the example library that we showed. They can kind of click through and want this and that to help people look what they find real fast. You can pull that off without any redundancy if you single source your example and use some automation to distribute that content throughout those different formats. Facilitate crowdsourcing. Enable your engineering organization to participate, so you'll have the knowledge of all of the engineers out there to contribute examples and help each other. And I also recommend prefer explanation of a reference. Don't try to cover all the nitty-gritty details. Don't try to cover all the variations in your example. That will just inflate them a lot. Make the examples so that they explain a concept, but they don't necessarily have to explain all of the things. And this was it. Thanks for watching. I hope that was useful for you. Have a great PlatformCon 2024.